Like many of you, I've been watching with great dismay the violence our southern neighbors have been facing over the recent days because of the death of George Floyd, a black man killed by a white police officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And many of us have been asking, why is this happening? Why have so many people responded to Mr. Floyd's death with such widespread violence? Where is this mass anger coming from? And here in Canada, we're asking the same questions. And Justin Trudeau has made comments about the systemic racism in Canada that has gotten a lot of attention in the last day or so. And political leaders and newspaper pundits, many of them white men over 50, responded by saying that there is no systemic racism in Canada, mainly because I haven't seen it. For me, as a white person in a position of authority, I don't think it's the time for me to opine on whether Canada is or is not systemically racist. I live in a lily white bubble where I don't see overt racism on a daily basis. I haven't experienced it or seen it personally. Most of my friends are pretty open-minded, so in my world, this doesn't exist. This is not an issue. But I can't depend on my own experience to decide what is happening and what has happened for other people in our community. Just because I can't point to it doesn't mean it's not there. It's like what a guy on Twitter said about this whole, do we have systemic racism or not? He says, I haven't experienced menstrual cramps, so I don't know what these women are talking about. I know I have blind spots and perhaps biases that I don't like to acknowledge, but they're there. Because for me, this is a time to listen to people of color. What has their experience been in Canadian society? What do they have to say to those of us who make up the majority in this country? How has, for example, our treatment of First Nations peoples through residential schools and other forms of discrimination shaped our community? What do our Jewish friends feel every time a synagogue or a cemetery gets vandalized or desecrated? What do our Muslim neighbors experience when they are being asked to explain or apologize for an extremist attack somewhere in the world, an attack that they had nothing to do with and are just as outraged as everyone else? What do our refugees feel when they are targeted for harassment, when they have lies told about them, about how many benefits they get, and how they're hassled on the train simply because they're wearing head covering? It's been noted by many watchers that when a white guy shoots up a school or something like that, and it's usually a he, he's described as a lone wolf, an individual acting on his own. He's not a white terrorist or a Christian extremist. In fact, it's not seen as an act of terrorism at all. We simply blame an individual. It's one person working alone. If a person of color commits the very same violent act, very often he, and again it's usually a he, is labeled a Muslim extremist or Islamic terrorist, and an entire religion or race becomes suspect and under scrutiny. Okay, I like to think of myself as non-racist. I'm sure you do too. Most people do. I'm a fairly progressive guy who likes to treat all people fairly, at least I think I do, and I'm sure you do as well. But often I have my blind spots exposed, and I see those times when my biases are uncovered. And those are times as it's an uncomfortable moment, but it's greater clarity, and it gives me greater understanding of how my race impacts others and the greater community. And while I didn't participate in historic atrocities, my ancestors did. So how did that shape me and my cultural heritage? Because white people were not being lynched in the southern US, but African Americans were. White people were doing the lynching. White people weren't being rounded up and put into camps during World War II in Canada, as happened to Japanese Canadians. White people instituted those policies. White people weren't taken from their families and forced to learn a different language and culture, while being abused physically, sexually, and culturally, just like our First Nations peoples were. And white people were in charge of the residential schools policies and administration of those schools. Okay, look, this isn't to beat up on white people, obviously, or shame people for being white. That would be silly. But this is to recognize a problem. Because it's not enough to say all lives matter when some lives are being taken away at greater rates than others, and others have been targeted for persecution more than others. For those of us who have benefited from a social and cultural system that privileged white people over others, today is a moment to listen to the angry voices of those who have been oppressed and discriminated against, both historically and today. Listening to understand those voices that are expressing the pain of generational trauma and immediate persecution can be a greater witness and more effective proclamation of the good news of the kingdom of God than any spoken words can have. So may today be a day of listening. We may not like what we hear. We may be challenged and even may feel insulted by some accusations that many people might hurl at us. But to listen to understand where the anger and pain is coming from, hearing the stories of people of color and what their lives are like, hearing the pain amidst the shouting, that's the first step towards the deep reconciliation that our world needs right now. Amen.